Who's Going to Be the Lesser Evil in 1968 by Hal Draper. First published in The Independent Socialist in January 1967. In 1968, when the presidential sweepstakes come up again, liberals all over the country are likely to face the California syndrome. At the risk of sounding like a Californian, I'm referring to the political pattern that was acted out in the recent Brown-Reagan contest in that state, whose denizens have this in common with New Yorkers, that they tend to think that whatever is happening in their state is what's happening. Sometimes it is. In '68, the problem is going to be, vote for Lyndon Johnson again or not. Among all those schizophrenic people you know whose heart is in the famous right place, viz. A little left of center, ulcers are going to ulcerate, psychiatrists' couches will get political, and navels will be contemplated with a glassy stare. Johnson or Nixon? Johnson or Romney? Johnson or Reagan? Johnson or anybody? As a matter of fact, even before this point is reached, there bids fair to be a similar pattern inside the Democratic Party machine itself. Johnson or Kennedy Fulbright, or its equivalent. Now, radicals have been wont to approach this classic problem with two handy labels, which in fact are fine as far as they go. One is called the Tweedledum Tweedledee pattern, and the other is called the Lesser Evil pattern. Neither of these necessarily quite describes what's happening. To see why, let's take a quick look at both of them in terms of 1968. 1. The '68 race could be a Tweedledum Tweedledee affair, and it may be. For example, Johnson versus Governor Romney. One can defy even Max Lerner to insert even a razor-thin sentence between the politics respectively represented by these two millionaires. In fact, there is bound to be a sector of liberal sentiment which would indeed see the lesser evil in Romney, since there is as yet no evidence that Romney is quite as rascally a liar as the present leader of the free world. But roughly speaking, these two are politically indistinguishable. This is the defining characteristic of the Tweedledum Tweedledee pattern. The sociological label for this invented by the professorial witch doctors is consensus politics. 2. In contrast, the lesser evil pattern means that there is a significant political difference between the two candidates. But, to explain the but, let's take, for reasons that will appear, not a current example, but the classic example. The day after Reagan's election as governor of California, a liberal pro-Brown acquaintance met me with haggard face and fevered brow, muttering, "Didn't they ever hear of Hitler? Didn't they ever hear of Hitler?" Did he mean Reagan was Hitler? "Well," he said darkly, "look how Hitler got started." A light struck me about what was going on in his head. "Look," I said, "you've heard of Hitler, so tell me this. How did Hitler become Chancellor of Germany?" My pro-Brown enthusiast was taken aback. "Why, he won some election or other, wasn't it? With terror and a Reichstag fire and something like that. That was after he had already become Chancellor. How did he become Chancellor of Germany?" Don't go away to look it up. In the 1932 presidential election, the Nazis ran Hitler, and the main bourgeois parties ran von Hindenburg, the Junker general who represented the right wing of the Weimar Republic, but not fascism. The Social Democrats, leading a mass workers' movement, had no doubt about what was practical, realist, hard-headed politics, and what was utopian fantasy. So they supported Hindenburg as the obvious lesser evil. They rejected with scorn the revolutionary proposal to run their own independent candidate against both reactionary alternatives, a line, incidentally, that could also break off the rank-and-file followers of the Communist Party, which was then pursuing the criminal policy of "after Hitler we come, and social fascists are the main enemy." So the lesser evil, Hindenburg, won, and Hitler was defeated. Whereupon President Hindenburg appointed Hitler to the chancellorship, and the Nazis started taking over. The classic case was that the people voted for the lesser evil and got both. Now 1966, America is not 1932. Germany, to be sure, but the difference speaks the other way. Germany's back was up against the wall. There was an insoluble social crisis. It had to go to revolution or fascism. The stakes were extreme. This is exactly why 1932 is the classic case of the lesser evil, because even when the stakes were this high, even then voting for the lesser evil meant historic disaster. Today, when the stakes are not so high, the lesser evil policy makes even less sense. In 1964, you know all the people who convinced themselves that Lyndon Johnson was the lesser evil as against Goldwater, who was going to do horrible things in Vietnam, like defoliating the jungles. Many of them have since realized that the spiked boot was on the other foot, and they lacerate themselves with the thought that the man they voted for actually carried out Goldwater's policy. In point of fact, this is unfair to Goldwater. He never advocated the steep escalation of the war that Johnson put through, and more to the point, he would probably have been incapable of putting it through with as little opposition as the man who could simultaneously hypnotize the liberals with Great Society rhetoric. So who was really the lesser evil in 1964? The point is that it is the question which is a disaster, not the answer. In setups where the choice is between one capitalist politician and another, the defeat comes in accepting the limitation to this choice. New development. For the moment, so much for the lesser evil pattern. But there is an interesting difference between the classic case, Hitler and Hindenburg in 1932, and the Johnson-Goldwater case. There really was a significant political difference between Hitler and Hindenburg. The general himself would never have fascised Germany. If he called the Nazi to the chancellorship, it was because he believed that the imposition of government responsibility was the way to domesticate the wild-talking Nazis, that the burden of actually having to run the country would turn the irresponsible extremists into tame politicians like all the others, in the pattern usually seen, as with the Hubert Humphreys. But Hindenburg himself was not a Hitler, and he really was a lesser evil. What the classic case teaches is not that the lesser evil is the same as the greater evil. This is just as nonsensical as the liberals argue it to be, but rather this: that you can't fight the victory of the rightmost forces by sacrificing your own independent strength to support elements just the next step away from them. This latter pattern is what has been going on in this country for the last 2 decades. Every time the liberal labor left has made noises about its dissatisfaction with what Washington was trickling through, all the Democrats had to do was bring out the bogey of the Republican right. The Liblabs would then swoon, crying, "The fascists are coming," and vote for the lesser evil. In these last 2 decades, the Democrats have learned well that they have the Liblab vote in their back pocket, and that therefore the forces to be appeased are those forces to the right. The Liblabs were kept happy enough if Hubert Humphrey showed up at a banquet to make his liberal speeches, or before that, by the Kennedy myth which bemused them even while the first leader on this planet poised his finger over the nuclear war button and said, "Or else." With the Liblab votes in a pocket, politics in this country had to move steadily right, until even a Lyndon Johnson could look like a lesser evil. This is essentially why, even when there really is a lesser evil, making the lesser evil choice undercuts any possibility of really fighting the right. But now notice this. When the lesser evil named Johnson was elected in 1964, he did not call in the greater evil to power, as did Hindenburg. He did not merely act in so flabby a manner that the right-wing alternative was thereby strengthened. Another classic pattern. These patterns would have been old stuff, the historic lesser evil pattern in full form. What was bewildering about Johnson was that the lesser evil turned out to be the greater evil, if not worse. Was it then the Tweedledum Tweedledee pattern after all? Am I merely then saying that the apparent difference between Johnson and Goldwater, even within the framework of capitalist politics, was just an illusion? Is the conclusion merely that all capitalist politicians have to be the same, that therefore the case against voting for the lesser evil is that there is no lesser evil? I don't think that's the answer. I think there is a third pattern around, which is neither Tweedledee Tweedledum nor the classic lesser evil choice. If the Johnson-Goldwater contest was one example, then an even better one was provided by the recent Brown-Reagan race. For Pat Brown really is a liberal, whatever you may think of Johnson, and thereby hangs the tale. Because this genuine liberal, Pat Brown, acted for 8 years as governor of California in no important respect differently from what a conservative Republican would have done. The operative word is acted. He sold out the water program to the big landholding companies, as his 2 Republican predecessors never dared to do. He fought tooth and nail for the bracero system, as no Republican governor of an agricultural state dared to do. It was he, not Clark Kerr, who in 1964 unleashed an army of police against the Berkeley students. After the Watts uprising, it was he who named John J. McCone's commission to whitewash the whole business, and who then supported the right wing's anti-riot law to intimidate the ghetto. It was Brown who gave the liberal Democratic CDC the final decapitation when he personally mobilized all his strength to oust Sick Cassidy as CDC head. If half of this had been done by a Reagan, the Lib Labs would be yelling fascism all over the place. As they will during the next 4 years, no doubt. And I repeat that I don't think this took place simply because Pat Brown was a Tweedledee reflecting image of Reagan. Here is a somewhat different interpretation. A profound change has taken place in this country since the days of the New Deal, has taken place in the nature of capitalist politics, and therefore in the two historic wings of capitalist politics, liberalism and conservatism. In the 1930s, there was a genuine difference in the programs put before capitalism by its liberal and conservative wings. The New Deal liberals proposed to save capitalism, at a time of deep-going crisis and despair, by statification, that is, by increasing state intervention into the control of the economy from above. It is notorious that some of the most powerful sectors of the very class that was being saved hated Roosevelt like poison. This added to the illusions of the Roosevelt Revolution at the time, of course. Roosevelt himself always insisted that a turn toward state capitalist intervention was necessary to save capitalism itself, and he was right. In fact, the New Deal conquered not only the Democratic, but the Republican Party. When Roosevelt's New Deal and Truman's Fair Deal were succeeded by Eisenhower's regime, the free enterprise spouting Republican continued and even intensified exactly the same social course that Roosevelt had begun. This is the reality behind the Birchite charge that Eisenhower is a card-carrying communist. In the 3.5 decades since 1932, and before, during and after a Second World War which intensified the process, the capitalist system itself has been going through a deep-going process of bureaucratic statification. The underlying drives are beyond the scope of this article. The fact itself is plain to see. The liberals who sparked this transformation were often imbued with the illusion that they were undermining the going system. Any child can now see that they knew not what they did. The conservatives who denounced all the steps in this transformation and who had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the new stage were also imbued with the very same illusion. But even Eisenhower, who has never been accused of being an egghead, and who, before he was nominated for the presidency, made exactly the same sort of free enterprise hurrah speeches as Reagan was paid to make for General Electric, even he was forced to act, in the highest office, no differently from a New Deal Democrat, because that is the only way the system can now operate. Fruits of lesser evilism. Under the pressure of bureaucratic statified capitalism, liberalism and conservatism converge. That does not mean they are identical or are becoming identical. They merely increasingly tend to act in the same way in essential respects, where fundamental needs of the system are concerned. And just as the conservatives are forced to conserve and expand the statified elements of the system, so the liberals are forced to make use of the repressive measures which the conservatives advocate, because the maintenance of the system demands it. Just as when Truman vetoed Taft-Hartley and then invoked it against striking workers. What is more, because the liberal politicians can point a warning finger towards the right, and because the Lib Labs will respond to it, they are even more successful than the conservatives in carrying out those measures which the conservatives advocate. It is not necessary to claim that even that pitiful man, Hubert Humphrey, is merely a hypocrite. No, I fully believe myself that he is as sincere a liberal as the next Lib Lab specimen. It is liberalism which requires the examination, not Humphrey's morals. Nor was that even more pathetic man, Adlai Stevenson, simply a rascal when he found himself lying like a trooper at the UN in the sight and knowledge of the whole world. So besides Tweedledee Tweedledums, and besides the lesser evils who really are different in policy from the greater evils, we increasingly are getting this third type of case. The lesser evils who, as executors of the system, find themselves acting at every important juncture exactly like the greater evils, and sometimes worse. They are the product of the increasing convergence of liberalism and conservatism under conditions of bureaucratic capitalism. There never was an era when the policy of the lesser evil made less sense than now. That's the thing to remember for 1968, as a starter.